40 is a specific kind of birthday. 30 still feels like the beginning of something. You've got decades ahead, plenty of time to course correct, plenty of room for the timeline to forgive a slow start. 40 doesn't feel like that. 40 feels like the point where you start doing math you didn't used to do. If I retire at 65, that's only 25 years of working left. Not 40, not 35, 25. And that number changes everything about what's actually still possible and what isn't. Here's what I want to do today, not just tell you what the average 40-year-old has accomplished, because honestly, the average isn't a particularly inspiring target. I want to walk through what you should have in place by 40 across the dimensions that actually predict your financial future, and then give you the specific catch up math for each one if you're behind. Because behind at 40 is a completely different problem than behind at 30, and the solutions have to be different too. My name is Dave, and I love helping people understand exactly where they stand and exactly what closing the gap actually requires, without the vague reassurance that everything will work out if you just stay positive. Let's get into it. Benchmark 1. 6 months of expenses and liquid savings. By 40, you should have a fully funded emergency fund covering 6 months of your actual monthly costs, sitting in an account you can access within a day or two. Here's why 6 months specifically matters more at 40 than it did at 30. Career risk changes shape as you age. At 30, if you lose a job, you're competing for replacement roles against a market that still sees you as adaptable, early career, cheap to hire. At 40, job search timelines for comparable roles tend to run longer. 6 months of runway isn't a comfortable cushion at this stage. It's closer to the minimum viable buffer, given how long a serious job search at this career stage can actually take. If you're behind on this one specifically, the catch up math is straightforward and doesn't require investment sophistication. Calculate your actual monthly costs, multiply by 6. That's the target. The fastest way to close this gap at 40 isn't aggressive investing, it's aggressive temporary saving, because this money needs to stay liquid and accessible, not compounding in the market where a downturn could hit exactly when you need to access it. Benchmark 2. A net worth roughly equal to twice your annual income. This is the financial benchmark most associated with 40, and it's worth being precise about where this number comes from. It's based on widely cited retirement planning models that work backward from a comfortable retirement at 65, assuming consistent saving and market average returns from this point forward. Here's the part that matters more than the number itself. This benchmark assumes you have 25 more years of saving and compounding ahead of you. If you're significantly below this number, the catch up isn't just about saving harder. It's about understanding that every year you're behind here costs disproportionately more to recover than the same gap would have cost at 30, because compound growth needs time. And time at 40 is the one resource you genuinely cannot manufacture more of. The catch up math specifically. If you're at half the target net worth for your income, the standard recommendation of saving 15% of income won't close the gap by 65. You need to run the actual numbers for your specific shortfall, but as a general rule, closing a meaningful gap discovered at 40 typically requires somewhere between 20% and 30% of gross income redirected to savings and investments for the next decade, which is a materially different commitment than the 10 to 15% that works fine if you started on schedule. This is uncomfortable to hear, and it's also just what the math requires. Benchmark 3. No high-interest consumer debt. By 40, credit card debt, payday loans, anything above roughly 8% interest should be fully eliminated, not managed, eliminated. The reason this matters disproportionately at 40 is the compounding runway problem again. Every dollar going to interest payments on high-interest debt at 40 is a dollar that has roughly half the compounding time remaining compared to that same dollar at 30. The opportunity cost of carrying this debt at 40 is measurably worse than carrying identical debt at 30, even though the debt itself is identical. The catch-up here is the avalanche method applied aggressively rather than gradually. List every high-interest balance by rate. Attack the highest rate first with every available dollar beyond minimums on the rest. At 40, this isn't optional flexibility. It's the single highest leverage move available before any other catch-up strategy can work properly, because every other strategy assumes the money isn't simultaneously bleeding out through interest payments. Benchmark 4. A retirement contribution rate that's actually tracked, not assumed. By 40, you should know your exact current savings rate as a percentage of gross income, not a vague sense that you're putting some away. Here's the uncomfortable pattern that shows up specifically at this age. A lot of people reach 40 having contributed inconsistently for 15 years. Some years at 10%, some years at 2%. Some years skipped entirely during a job change or a financial rough patch, and they've never actually calculated what their blended average rate has been. The number in their head, I save pretty consistently, and the actual number on paper are frequently very different. The catch-up move here is purely diagnostic before it's anything else. Calculate your actual average contribution rate over the last 5 years using your actual account statements. Then compare that number honestly to what the math says you need going forward given a 25-year runway instead of 35. For most people discovering they've been averaging 6 or 7% rather than the 15% they assumed, the catch-up isn't complicated. It's increasing the automated contribution percentage immediately today before reading any further, because every month at the old rate is a month of the gap getting marginally harder to close. Benchmark 5. Income that has grown faster than inflation over the last decade. This one gets skipped in most financial checklists, and it's arguably the most important non-obvious benchmark on this list. If your income at 40 has only kept pace with inflation since 30, you haven't actually gotten a raise in real terms in a decade. You're earning the same purchasing power you had 10 years ago, just measured in bigger numbers. This matters because savings rate has a ceiling determined by income. And if income has been flat in real terms, every other catch-up strategy on this list is fighting against a fixed pie rather than a growing one. The catch-up here is the one most people resist examining honestly. Has your income grown through deliberate moves, negotiated raises, strategic job changes, skill development that commanded a premium? Or has it grown passively through cost of living adjustments that just kept pace with inflation? If it's the second one, the single highest leverage catch-up move available at 40 isn't a budgeting change. It's a deliberate, researched, uncomfortable conversation about compensation, either with your current employer or with the market through a calculated job change. Income growth compounds every other catch-up strategy on this list. Without it, you're optimizing percentages of a number that isn't moving. Benchmark 6. Health metrics that haven't quietly become a financial liability. This benchmark sounds out of place on a financial checklist, and it genuinely isn't. By 40, your basic health metrics, blood pressure, cholesterol, weight trajectory, should be something you've actually checked recently rather than something you're avoiding finding out. Here's the specific financial mechanism this connects to. Healthcare costs in the decade between 40 and 50 are disproportionately influenced by decisions and conditions that are still highly correctable at 40 and significantly less correctable by 50. The financial catch-up plan you build today assumes a certain trajectory of healthcare costs over the next 25 years, and that trajectory is genuinely still being written at 40 in a way it isn't 10 years later. This isn't a moralizing point about willpower. It's a documented actuarial reality that gets ignored in almost every financial planning conversation. The catch-up here is simple to state and hard to execute. A baseline checkup if you haven't had one recently, an honest look at the trajectory rather than the current snapshot, and treating health spending now, gym access, better food, preventive care, as a financial line item rather than a separate category from the rest of this list. It is not separate, it's one of the largest uncontrolled variables in your 25-year financial projection. Benchmark 7. Skills that are portable rather than purely tenure dependent. By 40, your professional value should rest at least partly on skills you could take to a different employer, or even a different industry, not entirely on institutional knowledge specific to your current company that only has value where you currently sit. This matters because of a specific risk that increases with age. Layoffs and restructuring disproportionately affect employees in the 40 to 55 range, often explicitly framed around cost rather than performance. If your accumulated value is mostly tenure and company-specific relationships rather than transferable skill, you're carrying a risk that compounds the closer you get to that age range without you necessarily seeing it building. The catch-up here is specific and time-bound. Identify one skill in your field that's genuinely transferable and in demand, and commit to developing it over the next 12 months. Not abstractly, but with a specific credential, project, or measurable outcome attached. This isn't about anxiety over job security. It's about understanding that the 25-year runway you're now working with has less room to absorb an unplanned multi-year income disruption than the 35-year runway did, which makes the insurance value of portable skill genuinely higher at this stage than it was a decade earlier. Here's what ties all seven of these together, and it's the thing worth understanding before you do anything else with this list. None of these are catch-up strategies in isolation. They compound against each other exactly the way debt and savings compound against each other. Eliminating high interest debt frees up the cash flow that fixes the contribution rate problem. Fixing the income growth problem expands the ceiling on every percentage based catch up strategy above it. Health spending taken seriously now reduces an unknown variable in the 25-year projection that would otherwise force every other number to be more conservative than necessary. The honest reality of being behind at 40 is that the runway is shorter, which means less margin for sequential fixes done one at a time over the next decade. What works is identifying the two or three benchmarks above where you're furthest behind and attacking those specifically and simultaneously rather than spreading effort evenly across all seven. 40 isn't too late. The math genuinely still works from here. But it works because of deliberate, somewhat uncomfortable, concentrated effort over the next several years, rather than the slow, gradual drift toward improvement that would have been sufficient if it started at 30. You have 25 years. That's still a long time. It's just no longer an unlimited one. Use it accordingly.